Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Scott Becker, Ph.D. And Scott and I recently did a podcast on the life and ideas of James Hillman. And today, Scott, we are going to talk about facing the monster, the dark side of technology, social media, and the change that's happening around us within technology in general. And Scott, I think I mentioned last time that you were past director of the Counselling Centre at Michigan State University. You're now in private practice, and you assisted James Hillman on Inhuman Relations. I think that's, what is it, volume 7 of the Uniform Edition?
Volume 7, that's right.
And you also provided political commentary on Dick Russell's book, The Life and Ideas of James Hillman. So welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's fun to be back and kind of extending that conversation, because the book I'm writing really does flow out of all the engagement I've had with Hillman's work over the years. It's centrally informed by the way he approaches problems in the world.
Right. Well, Scott, just before we get in, I was thinking this morning when I woke up, when there was that whole lockdown time, it was very strict policy here.
Yes.
But I
Yes, it
have a
was.
little, so in one way, there was, the net, Facebook, and it was a lifeline, and it was wonderful. And I have a little bit of a love-hate going on with it sometimes, especially Facebook, because the thing is, in one sense, it was a lifeline when I was in that cave of the strict lockdown or whatever, and you come across new people, like you hear about Coleman Barks or someone else,
Yes.
and people share information, and it's fantastic. But then there's the other side of it. It was like being thrown into the culture war. All of a sudden, like, I felt as if Nancy Pelosi and Mitch, McConnell, and it's like you get thrown into the whole kind of culture war at the same time, and it can be polarizing, and so, I mean, that's
Yes.
my experience of a little bit of what's happening now. But I wanted to ask you, how did you get onto this topic? How did it come about? Where was it born from?
Right. Well, partly it was born out of my recognition that something was happening as a national trend in the US with college student mental health. So, in my role in a large university, Michigan State is one of the largest in the country here. It's about 50,000 students. And so we had good data. We could track trends somewhat more easily than smaller institutions. And what we were noticing within the Big Ten and nationally was a radical increase in the prevalence of mental health issues and the severity of mental health issues among college students, both undergrad and graduate. So I had trend data in front of me, and it was dramatic enough that there probably was an historical event or a process, something endemic to the culture that was impacting all that. And while that was brewing in my head, and I was using, archetypal psychology as a lens, I was using, um, political theory, but what prompted the direction toward digital technology and social media was a question from a colleague of mine, who was an associate director of the Career Center. Her name was Linda Gross, and Linda, after a meeting, was saying, why do our students come into advising appointments with almost minimal interest in forming a relationship with us as the career counselor? Why do they have trouble making eye contact? Why do they want to get in and get out? And essentially, they want us to give them a handout, do something brief and informational rather than exploratory, contextual, or relational. And she was saying that their staff were struggling with this. They were feeling that they were maybe out of touch, but she hadn't really thought about the why yet. So she was asking me, and I didn't have a great answer other than to say our staff were having sort of parallel struggles. So students were coming in not wanting just information, but wanting how they were feeling to go away. When I started my career, it was in the early 90s in graduate school, and students would come in with a basic understanding of what therapy was and wanting to tell their story, wanting to reflect, wanting to make meaning, essentially.
Yeah.
And certainly to change their symptoms and feel better, but also to make sense of their lives.
Hmm.
The trend in recent years has, or at least at the time that this came up, this would be about 10 years ago, was toward in university counseling was, I don't like the way I feel. What can I do to make it stop?
Right.
So it was very symptom focused and still similar to the career counseling context, make this go away. I want to feel differently.
Yeah.
So I started mulling that over and thinking about the changes that had happened. And by the way, there's a lot of research that supports this idea. I've since explored most fields in social science and neuroscience and all the cultural analysis, and this is now a paradigm, and it's not
Yeah.
just mine. This is
Yeah.
a framework that's used broadly, but there wasn't one at the time. So this was an intuition. This was a thought that I had based on my work as a trauma therapist.
Yeah.
What we know in trauma theory is that neglect is as impactful as trauma, abuse, as events that happen to us. The absence of caring and support, emotional neglect, also has an impact on specifically on neurological development. There are parts of the brain that don't develop well in the absence of caring, nurturing, someone to say there's abuse, that's mitigated by a parent that then helps us calm down and says it's okay and I've got you and creates safety. And we know that that impacts certain parts of the brain developing at different rates. So I had an intuition that what might be happening with our students was something neglectful. And it occurred to me that the excessive screen time that they were experiencing, this was shortly after the advent of really sophisticated smartphones in the States. So,
Yeah.
and they've since backtracked this mental health trend to about that point where
And what
the
year
social
was
media platforms,
Scott?
around
What
2000,
time period was this?
around 2006, the
Right.
internet had an impact earlier, but around 2006,
Yeah. Okay.
when cell phone dissemination was really broad. So I started importing uh, trauma theory and the sub context of neglect, and started looking for research that might suggest that excessive screen time leads to decreased social interaction, decreased nurturing, decreased exchanges of empathy and perspective taking. And does that have an impact on the brain? And lo and behold, it does. So some of the first research was actually in South Korea, where they have a
Yeah.
very high per capita cell phone use.
Yeah.
And their research were calling what they were seeing there, the loss of executive function, as digital dementia.
Right.
And then a German researcher by the name of Manfred Spitzer picked that up.
Yeah.
And his book in German is Digital Demenz. And then other neuroscience researchers picked this up in the UK and in the States and many other countries. And at this point, it's a paradigm. There is research that tries to debunk this idea that's saying, well, there could be other factors, or this is not all the studies are longitudinal. But my feeling about all this is, in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors in science, it's much better to have a false positive, meaning, oh, something is happening, than a false negative, which is, oh, it's probably fine, nothing is going on.
Mm.
I'd rather have 100 false positives in this area, because if this is the case, then what we're seeing now is a cohort effect for the half of the world's population that has strong access to this in
Mm.
terms of fundamental brain structures not developing at the same rate, particularly in the right hemisphere that for most people governs emotion, empathy, perspective taking, and the integration relevant to your topics, imagination. So if we have a lopsided brain, that the left side of the brain, the thinking analytical side of the brain, and the frontal cortex are developing mostly normally,
Yeah.
but these other structures aren't because we're not doing face-to-face communication. Because this is the irony of Facebook. Where on Facebook is the face-to-face
Yeah.
connection?
Mm.
And that's what we're seeking. That's why it feels better because we're learning about people. We do see some photos.
Mm.
There's a sense of relatedness. But as you said, along with that, there's all kinds of conflict. And ultimately, even the positive aspects of social media end up being a form of addiction because we're not getting the full effect, the full impact of what it means to be in person. So as that research started coming out, I started
Yeah.
looking at um, our mental health data, our trend data through that lens.
So Scott,
So
just
decreased
going
capacity to
back,
regulate.
just for
Yeah.
my benefit, what you're
Yep.
saying is that as we've got hooked into social media more and hooked into technology,
Yep.
there's been a form of neglect that's happened with a certain,
Yep.
well, you're saying kind of like things associated with the right side of the brain, but social, social interaction, real social interaction, and what's connected with that. Is that kind of it?
Yeah. If children are looking at a screen and they're not interacting with a caregiver or another child, then
Yeah.
there are parts of the brain and the nervous system that don't develop at the same rate. So, and all this is inadvertent, of course. The
Yeah.
technology was sold to us as a means of not just entertainment, but a way to make children smarter. It's a
Mm.
computer. So,
Mm.
of course, they're getting smarter. And in some ways, we have. Our
Mm.
information processing has advanced rapidly, capacity
Mm.
to rapidly make sense of what we're seeing and what we're reading.
Yeah.
If it's superficial, if it's
Mm.
just information, we have
Mm.
a much faster processing capacity. But in the meantime, our long-term memory is suffering. Our capacity to understand facial expressions and
Mm.
to give and receive empathy, to really benefit from this is back to my colleague's question. An undeveloped nervous system doesn't benefit as much from the offer of support and empathy and compassion. They just want the information. And actually, when we do receive it, there's a bit of a feeling of overload. Teenagers in the US prefer texting to talking face to face at this point
Wow.
because the face to face feels like too much.
Yeah.
So we're losing some of our human capacities. And actually, there's a book published in Australia. I think he's originally from the UK, but I have it here somewhere. Um, it's by Richard King. It's called
Yeah.
Here Be Monsters,
Mm.
and he's basically saying is technology reducing our humanity.
Right.
So, and this he's writing from the perspective of humanities and culture criticism.
Mm.
But I guess my point would be whether we look at it from a social science perspective or a neuroscience perspective
Yeah.
or this lens of cultural criticism or depth psychology, it all starts to look like, well, we're losing something essential
Mm.
that will help us stay calm,
Yeah.
feel connected, be able to
Yeah.
cope with the the stress and the chaos that's happening in the world. So that's how this whole thing broadened out for me. I started looking not only at technology but the impact of climate change, etc.
Etc. Scott, can I just ask one other quick question? There's a book called
Yep.
Irresistible by Adam Alter,
Yep.
and it talks about the rise of technology and the business of keeping us hooked. So, what are some of the how are some of the ways it's doing that as well? I mean, what are some of the factors that are drawing
Yep.
people in?
By the way, Adam Alter is also an Aussie, so uh,
Right.
kudos. There must be something cultural about this. But But what he's saying is, there are labs. There's one at Stanford, for example, called the Persuasive Technology Lab. It's run by a man named BJ Fogg,
Yeah.
and designers go there to learn how to design apps, video games, websites that are more
Addictive.
addictive, based on colors, based on frequency of rewards, based on the sounds and shapes and the way things are placed on the screen. They literally are designed to bypass our rational thought and to create compulsive behavior. There's a researcher, a designer, who
Mm.
quit Google. His
Yeah.
name's Tristan Harris. And he
Yeah.
calls this whole process of manipulation, he calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem,
Right.
because
Mm.
they're bypassing our thinking. So you don't
Mm.
decide that you want to keep scrolling. You just
Mm.
want to.
Mm.
And it's very manipulative. It's literally addictive. It tends to erode neural pathways in the same pattern that other forms of drug addiction do. So the brain scan of a high-end video addict who's playing constantly very
Mm.
closely resembles structurally the brain of a heroin addict.
Right.
And this digital overuse, this digital addiction, is also fueling other forms of addiction. You could say it's a gateway drug. So the young brain that's been in front of a screen for 15 years is more likely to need overstimulation
Relation.
from other sources.
Yeah.
So moving from digital stimulus to chemical stimulus.
It's like in Joseph Campbell, when you wander out of the village and go into the forest and you reach the cave and there's a monster. It's like
Yes.
you've reached the monster, don't you? And but
Yeah.
now it's like there's something a bit insidious about the monster. We don't quite know how the monster's eating us up.
That's true. And that's where my thinking broadened, because
Mm.
to a large extent, everyone who's buying this technology was unaware. The people
Mm.
creating the technology were. So here's a little bridge. The people at the top end of the tech industry did not give their own children the devices that they were selling to everyone else's children. This is revealed in interviews, and it's basically public information. So
Yeah.
if this device is too dangerous for your kid, but not for everyone else's, then and I would say Adam Alter and the documentary that Tristan Harris created called The Social Dilemma. It
Mm.
was on the Netflix platform here in the States.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's available in Australia,
It
but
is. Yeah.
so in these interviews, insiders confirm that this is deliberate, that they know it's addictive, and that the bottom line, the profit motive, is driving all of this behavior,
Mm.
independent of consequences, whether that's psychological or neurological or social or political. And the social dilemma outlines the political consequences, which are that the algorithms have been gradually nudging everyone out to the margins of political thought because they're monetizing the usage. So if someone watches a video longer, that makes more money.
Yeah.
And which videos are watched longer? The ones with more extreme content, the more ones that are more inflammatory. So
Yeah.
both left and right have the metaphor in the documentary is it's if you just tilt the table 1 or 2 degrees, people start to slide up to the margins. And you can make effort to stay toward the middle, but it takes effort, and most people won't. Most people just slide with what's being presented to them.
Right.
So the monster
Mm.
is the device itself. At a certain point, we have to look at the power structures in the plutocracy and the technocracy and say, well, what political agendas might be driving this other than just a pure profit motive and a lack of foresight, which is
Mm.
possible.
Mm.
But what happens when we start to look at who's profiting from this? Why are they not putting the brakes on it? Why is there not a Hippocratic oath of digital design? I actually had a phone call from someone who worked in the tech industry and said, I want my company to develop essentially a Hippocratic oath. And they
Mm.
were working with me on what that might look like. But they
Mm.
basically said no one else in my company is even remotely interested in that.
you could maybe send that idea to Rupert Murdoch, who's another Australian, by the way, and
Just to
not
find
quite
balance
like
there.
the
Yeah.
ones you'd mentioned, but
No,
um, that could be good, a Hippocratic oath at Fox News. But
well, and that's just it. It's the
and
absence of, yeah.
the
I'll get to
it,
it.
it's kind of, I don't know what it seems to me. What you're saying, I think even maybe Jung said this, is that the our moral capacity is not going at the same speed as the technological. So the technology is racing ahead, but our ability to stay up with it.
That's right. And if you look at another Jungian, the work of Robert Romanishin,
Yeah,
his book in the 80s on technology called Technology as Symptom and Dream, and
yeah,
his more recent book on Frankenstein,
yeah.
both outline this. And it's the absence of moral sense. That's sort of Hillman's phrase. He was saying it's not morality, it's our capacity to know on kind of an animal level to sense when things are wrong. And so if the people making these decisions are lacking,
Mm,
and there is a good amount of research that says that traits of narcissism and psychopathy and Machiavellianism
mm,
and sadism, they're called the dark tetrad. So four clusters of personality traits that tend toward callousness and manipulation. If that's overrepresented in the higher levels of corporate America and political leadership, then we're looking at a worldview that doesn't necessarily care about the social moral impact of all these decisions and this technology and how it's being used.
which
So
is
that's one of the monsters that I think we have to look at is our leadership may not care,
mm,
at least in the way that we do. And they may not have their eyes on the same value system or
mm,
decision making process. So that's all this stuff gets pretty scary and overwhelming, which is also the point of the book. It's how do we face these things? I mean, part of it is putting a face on things, understanding it, being able to imagine what's happening,
yeah,
but also having the courage to confront it without shutting down, without becoming overwhelmed, and without feeling that we either have to launch into some kind of bloody revolution or numb ourselves out, which I think is what most people are opting for. The middle ground
mm,
is awareness. It's mindful awareness. It's returning to embodiment. It's
mm,
calming down our individual and collective alarm system,
mm.
and it's trying to find a more grounded stance so that we can decide when and how to push back a little bit and to restore some balance and to avoid being caught up in the digital manipulation and avoid being overwhelmed by the other impact of technology, which is climate change, it's global warming. And there's a lot of alarmist messaging about that. So, whereas we are being put into fight or flight and we're dissociative because of digital technology and social media and political messaging, but we're also hearing from the press that it may already be too late and we may be looking at the sixth extinction event. And
Yeah.
so I think we're numbing out. I think we're disconnecting morally, but also just physiologically and emotionally. We're dissociative. We're frozen.
So it seems to me that you, like, apart from the big picture of what's happening with technology, you kind of started to marry up with your expertise in trauma theory as well.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
guess you're having clients come along to you, with that feeling of being overwhelmed and all of that.
Yes.
So where are you going with it all, Scott? I mean, well, I think you just said then the whole sense of grounding and
Yeah, that's the goal. The
moving
question is
into,
how we get there. Right.
yeah. So
So if we
what
look
do
at,
you think?
right. I mean, that is, it has to be a multi-pronged, multifaceted, um, diversified set of approaches because one approach to all this is not going to be broad enough. So lots of different things could help.
Yeah,
With digital technology, it's unplugging to start with. It's using it less. First of all, recognizing that it's an addiction. There are actual forms of therapy that have been developed to address digital addiction.
yeah,
There are formalized, structured models to address that. So with tech, it's unplug, and recognize that we don't really want to. With feeling overwhelmed with the news cycles and the terrifying messages that there are now, off the top of my head, I could probably list a dozen ways the world could end as we know it.
Mm.
I'm not going to do that because my goal isn't to fall into the same trap of scaring everybody. But I think most people off the top of their head could come up with, half a dozen easily, just
Mm.
ways that the world could fall into, um, essentially another extinction event. So getting grounded can happen in multiple ways. Essentially, the biggest step in trauma work individually is to start with the body. It's to start with the breath. The breath is one of the ways that we can reach the alarm system, which is in terms of brain structure, the amygdala. So our thinking brain can't tell the amygdala to slow down, but the thinking brain can slow down our breath. And there are very specific models for breathing now that send a signal from the body back to the alarm system by switching on the parasympathetic. And basically, the amygdala starts to fire less often to slow down. So starting with the body, starting with the breath, starting with what are called grounding techniques, which involve creating sensory input back from the body to the brain. And it's not initially psychological. It's not initially about our thoughts or our emotions or our imagination, really. Although imagery can be used as part of the grounding process, the joke about go to your happy place, it's actually going to a safe place.
Mm.
And the best option is someplace that we've lived in, seen, experienced in 3 dimensions as a as an embodied person. But it can
Yeah.
also be just a place that you imagine that feels safe. So the imagery also feeds back into this lower part of the brain, and it combines with deep breathing and muscle relaxation, which is actually tensing and then relaxing the muscles. So we're trying to create combination of input back to our fight or flight system that we're
Mm.
actually safe. Problem with a global threat, of course, is that it's abstract and that we're not totally safe. We're not in a world where we can't uh, reasonably imagine lots of different ways that it can end. So it's a little bit more difficult for that reason. And it's also very collective. So even if only 10% of the population start doing this, you've still got a lot of other people who are still scared. And you could say with good reason. With trauma therapy, the assumption is traumatic events are over. You're out of that situation. It happened a decade or it happened 3 decades ago. And we just have to convince your body that it's safe again.
Right.
So the challenge now is using all these techniques, but also acknowledging that there is legitimate existential dread going on. There is a global threat from multiple directions. I'll just give one example.
Mm.
The head of AI for Google,
Mm.
Mo Gaudat,
Yeah.
a brilliant Egyptian computer scientist, has quit
Yeah.
and is trying to get the word out, has written a book called Scary Smart,
Yeah.
and is saying that AI is possibly months away from what they call the singularity in that field, and that this could mean a deep, profound change in our way of life, or something very dangerous, or it could possibly solve a lot of our problems and create a sort of technologically supported utopian vision. But he's sounding the alarm strongly.
Mm.
And interestingly, and this is the next step, this is what I want to emphasize. What he's drawing on, because he's Egyptian, what he's
Yeah.
drawing on is Sufism.
Mm.
And all this, by the way, was prompted by the death of his son.
Right.
He had a spiritual awakening. He had
Yeah.
an existential spiritual moment,
Yeah.
and what he's arriving at is this Sufi idea, and it's quoted in multiple Jungian and archetypal contexts: die before you die. So coming to terms with our mortality, dissolving the ego, all the things we talked about with the biography,
Yeah.
we become more grounded when we identify with soul, with spirit, with
Mm.
something deeper and broader and more important than ourselves. So ultimately, we do want to slow the body down, but we also have to, and this is another main focus of the book, we have to create a new worldview or connect with much older ones that define the self as much more than just me and my,
Yeah.
that
And
define the
I
self
can I say one thing
as
there, Scott? I saw
absolutely.
a video, and a person I like reading is Rich Tarnas, and uh,
Yeah,
I think the video he was talking about was this period of time as a death, rebirth mystery, which seems to me like an
that's right.
old idea, the initiatory idea. But the thing being that death and rebirth often go together. It seems like a context,
That's right.
because yes, where there's can be an apocalyptic kind of view that if there's that thought of the death rebirth mystery, then it's an initiatory process, isn't it? And we don't know how that's going to work up, and there are very much real threats, as you say, and all of that. But within the psyche, we can feel the new shoots of the green. We can feel that, through the
Exactly.
slow work, through the,
Exactly. And
mm,
that's where the book is perfectly aligned with Jungian and archetypal thought and some of these mystical spiritual traditions, which is we move away from the literal threats and the fear of the death of the body, and we start
mm,
to imagine and experience something deeper and broader. So
mm,
one book, by the way, that supports exactly what you were just saying is was published by Spring Publications under Hillman, and it's
right,
called Dreaming the End of the World. This is a book by Michael Ortiz Hill,
right,
and it's I have it here because I anticipated maybe bringing this up. The full title is Dreaming the End of the World: Apocalypse as a Rite of Passage,
yeah,
and it's perfectly aligned with what you just said, because this new, or we could say very old worldview,
mm,
this non-dualistic, interconnected, holistic isn't the right word, but this deeper underlying unity,
mm,
the sense of harmony between humanity and nature, between life and death, between the material world and the invisible world. That worldview is emerging in lots of different forms now.
yeah,
There are feminist versions of it. There are LGBTQ versions of it. Queer theory is really interesting in this regard. A
yeah,
non-dualistic. They're deconstructing all categories. There's an ecological version of it. There's a version of it from quantum physics. There's a whole
yeah,
study of subquantum consciousness that you and I have chatted about. But it's basically the idea that the underlying unified field below string theory is more or less identical with
the
the deep
collective,
consciousness described in Vedic meditation. And the mathematics of both of those, of the science and the meditative tradition, follow the same numerical patterns to the point where prominent physicists are saying what we were discovering in physics is that the universe is intelligent and conscious in some capacity.
and
So this
interconnected.
underlying, yes. So if all these different fields are percolating this idea at the same time,
They are
it
the green
suggests
shoots of an
exactly. So the
emergence. Yeah,
rebirth, exactly. And the complexity is for some people it feels like a dreadful ending, a literal ending of all life as we know it. And for
yeah,
others it feels like, well, finally, this patriarchal, capitalistic, plutocratic, dualistic, competitive, destructive system that we've superimposed on the world is finally collapsing. It's finally dissolving. We talked about astrology last time in terms of the US falling apart, there's a narrative in astrology that we're having our national Pluto return. So Pluto takes about 250 years to make a full orbit of the sun. And that's happening now in the US birth chart. So at 29 degrees Capricorn, when the US started, that's exactly where Pluto is right now as we speak. It's retrograded back into Capricorn. And that represents a comeuppance, an ending, a rebirth, but especially the structures that have supported the US and its
fallen.
imperialism collapsing.
You
But the
know, I
rebirth is the point. Exactly as you say, the rebirth and the
mm,
new things that are coming up, the new ideas and the healing that's happening in lots of different ways, in lots of different parts of the world, in lots of different worldviews
and
and
within
paradigms,
our own psyche as well.
and within our own psyche.
It reminds me, Scott, of the colours in Stan Marlin. In the sense
Oh
of
yeah, yep,
the blackening. So
the
the
blackening.
blackening we often see in such a negative way, but then it was so beautiful the way he described it, that is actually the beginning of maybe perhaps being able to see something in a new way, and then slowly, what is it? It's like we move through, colors
Yes,
into a different way of being able to see things or whatever. I mean, to
well,
me, it's
absolutely.
what's happening.
Well, yeah, the in astrology it would be Scorpio represents the dissolution and the death.
Yeah.
And Sagittarius is the sign that comes right after that represents the rebirth, the phoenix rising from the ashes. But the death
Right.
has to happen. It's part
Yeah.
of the cycle because
Right.
it can't deepen by remaining literal and structured. It has to dissolve its literal attachments and its style of consciousness in order to
Mm.
find this broader, deeper level of awareness. So yes, absolutely. Alchemically and astrologically,
Logically,
and in lots
both.
of other esoteric systems, the falling apart piece, the tower in the tarot, that's not a literal ending, nor is death a literal ending in the tarot.
Mm.
It's something is ending and something else will appear within that. But it's
But,
trusting that gap.
well, that might be a little bit hard. I don't know. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but that might be a little bit hard if someone's just come to see you for the first time, overwhelmed. You can't
Well, that's
quite
right.
say, well, after the black, then we become a white
No, there has to
or
be a
a red.
container, right? In alchemy and in every other transformative process, there has to be a chrysalis. There has to
Mm.
be trust there has to be temenos, as the Jungians call it. There has to
Yeah.
be uh, a sacred space, a safe sacred space. And in therapy, that doesn't usually happen in the first hour. I've had some very good first hours with clients, people who are very ready for this, who've had previous therapy. They understand what it means to engage deeply. But yeah, initially you're just trying to establish safety, especially with trauma, by the way.
Yeah.
Establishing safety is incredibly challenging sometimes because of everything that's happened before. But yes, the goal is create trust in the process of falling apart.
Mm.
The caterpillar doesn't panic when it
Mm.
spins the chrysalis and turns to goo.
Mm.
It knows, presumably, we think, on some
Mm.
level that literal dissolving in the case of the caterpillar is going to lead to becoming a butterfly.
Mm.
But that's a process within therapy, and collectively, we don't have really many containers right now. We don't have many interconnections. We don't have mutual trust. I mean, there's data, this is political. In the
Yeah.
US, roughly half of all Democrats and half of all Republicans fear the other party,
Yeah.
not just disagree with them, they
Mm.
fear them. So that fear, that collective fear, is an obstacle to creating the very containers that would allow us to start to have dialogue. But there are lots of creative folks who are creating those spaces. There are people who are trying to engage collectively. Mary Watkins comes to mind. She has theater
Yeah.
where people come
Yeah.
to witness,
And I think
the trauma of the teenagers. Yeah,
to be fair, okay, we can talk about, the love hate with Facebook and the polarization and the conflict that is in your face and all of that. But there is the other side of it where you see people morph from what is it, posting maybe some quotes, some Rumi quotes or something, and then slowly they're
yeah,
becoming creative, and then they're writing their own stuff, and
yeah,
you get this feeling that, and whichever
yeah.
way it's happening, but you get this feeling that there's an underground creative explosion which has been democratized, you know, and
Yep,
it's kind of like people are finding their own voice and their own style, and you can have your own little media business for 100 people or whatever. So it's kind
absolutely. And that's the I know Hillman didn't like the word hope, and it's we definitely should avoid hope for the wrong thing or a
yeah,
passive hope, a
yeah,
hope that waits for a rescue from above. But the energy that I see
Mm.
the inklings of, because when do the tips break ground? It's after the roots have grown. So you have to pay close attention to all these changes that are happening, the grassroots, you could say,
Yeah.
movements. The initial growth is below ground. It's below the surface of awareness. But I believe you're right. I think we're seeing the beginnings of lots of different mythopoetic, ecological, feminist, non-dualistic, spiritual, mystical,
Views that are being
so many,
expressed,
so
that are
many.
being
Yeah,
expressed. Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So that's it's a figure ground problem because in the
Mm.
foreground, for a lot of people, are all the threats, all the monsters,
Mm.
the looming, realistically dreadful possibilities that are happening. But in the midst of all that, there is courage, there's creativity, there's original synthesis, there's uh, nonviolent, rebellious rhetoric that says we can and should do this differently. I'm thinking of a poem that came out. Essentially it's an open letter from the COVID virus to
Mm.
humanity, and it's a beautiful expression of, look, there's an opportunity here. There's a window
Mm.
that's opening, and we could just stop all the things that aren't working. It's
Mm.
so there are all these inklings of the change that I think is happening. And in the Social Dilemma documentary, there's a quote, I think from Aldous Huxley or somebody, that says, "In the race toward apocalypse or the end of the world, there'll be a photo finish between essentially apocalypse and utopia." So it's as we move forward, it's not clear, but let's put it this way: this is how Jung talked about imagining some form of life after death. If we imagine something more, then we're living in alignment with our instincts. If we imagine spiritually, and if we lean toward the idea of connection and something emerging out of all this chaos,
Mm.
then we have something that can ground us in the meantime. We don't have to win the battle in order to joyfully fight it.
Yeah.
But that involves, a transpersonal perspective.
Yes. Well, Scott, I mean, maybe we're getting close to, but I just wonder whether maybe you could talk about just briefly. You were talking about Zeus and Typhon, and
Okay,
as
so
a myth
yes.
for now or whatever. What is that about?
All right. So it occurred to me when I was trying to find an image for climate change that there is this pattern, not just in Greek myth, but
Yeah.
across multiple traditions, of the sky god fighting the earth mother, or fighting the monstrous serpent, the monstrous dragon. And this has been called, broadly, it's been called the Chaos Kampf in German, the war against chaos. So in these myths, and
Yeah.
we'll stick with Zeus and Typhon.
Yeah.
Zeus is the sky god.
Yeah.
Typhon is a monster that's been created by Gaia in
Yeah.
response to an offense. Zeus has offended, as Zeus often does, and this incredibly enormous, overwhelmingly grotesque and dangerous monster Typhon is created. It has the legs of a serpent, and it
Yeah.
has 100 heads or 100 hands. It screeches and screams and growls. Interestingly, the heads are animal heads,
Yeah.
oxen and lions. And
Wow.
so this creature reaches up to the sky, the arms reach across the sky, and the gods themselves, including Zeus, are utterly terrified and flee. The only god who doesn't lose their cool, who stays grounded, is Athena. And that archetype is going to be an interesting touchstone for the book. What is it? What is Athenian, and how do we access that energy, and how do we not flee and regress and freeze?
Yeah.
So Athena convinces Zeus to fight,
Mm.
and he's initially defeated in a lot of these traditions. So the monster wins the first battle, and then they regroup. sometimes literally, sometimes they're dismembered and
mm,
they reconfigure. But
mm,
Zeus gets the lightning bolts and uses the lightning bolts to defeat Typhon and then drops a mountain on his head. And then the volcanic eruptions are the manifestation of Typhon trapped under the earth. There's a move I'm going to make in the book with this idea that's
yeah.
a little bit hard to convey in brief, but that idea of uh, there's one perspective that basically is personified by Zeus and the
Yeah.
sky god, sort of control from above. And there's this other perspective of what is
What's right,
natural, what is,
what's rising from below, and the
yes, the earth.
unconscious.
Yes. So that's the split that we're in. And I'm going to explore ways to look at older versions of this myth and reconfigure it a bit so that we can reimagine our relationship to that monster.
Mm,
Because I don't think we can just zap it and throw it under the mountain again.
mm,
But that's a way to imagine what's happening now, is it's this something from below is reemerging. The planet itself seems to be angry.
mm. And
The
whatever's been
typhoons, yeah.
and whatever's been suppressed or repressed is also.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the return of the natural world that we've been trying to dominate and control and essentially use as a resource
Mm,
for, at least
games.
10,000 years. Yep. Yeah. But that's difficult because that means our whole worldview is
Mm,
based on a false dichotomy or based on a unnecessary hierarchy. And
yeah.
so reworking that is a task and a half. But I'm hoping to use imagery as a way to convey something that's pretty difficult to do conceptually. I think it's
Yeah.
compelling as myth, and it also evokes the same capacity that we need to get grounded, which is essentially imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, neurologically, imagination is the two sides of our nervous
Yeah.
system working together in harmony with the body. That's in alchemy, that's true imagination as opposed to fantasy.
Yes.
True imagination draws from all of our experience and creates an image that connects. Fantasy is dissociative. So what I'm trying to evoke is that deeply imaginative take on all this so that we can start to, per the title of the book, put a face on things that becomes more manageable, that allows us to imagine a way through
The present.
that doesn't involve war or destruction or, a sixth extinction event. It's
Yes.
starting to sound yeah, go ahead.
That's good,
I'm
and
just
maybe that's a good place to leave it. And I'm trying to think of what you've got me excited in now is going back to the book of myths and the monster stories, and the one of outwitting the monster and or befriending the or whatever. But they're the kind of
well, that's
things.
that's the question, is could we have a conversation, if not with the monster? By the way, the word monster comes from monstrum, which is an avatar of a god. Or in the
Right.
case of the Zeus myth, it's Gaia as a Titan. But the
Yeah.
monster is a symptom. The monster is a form that the god takes, the god that we've offended. The
Mm,
monster is the scary avatar of an energy that we probably could, instead of defeating it, we probably could have a dialogue.
yeah.
I did
Oh.
some of this in the intro to volume 7 of the Uniform Edition. It's and there the myth is of Medusa, but it's
Mm.
it's reimagining our relationship with Medusa as the monster. So yeah,
Well,
it's ambitious, I know, but that's I what I like about it is that
yeah. Well,
it's
that's the
broad
kind
enough
of
that I think
no. That's what we need. I mean, it's kind of like the status quo is business as usual isn't much of an option, is it? And it's kind of like, and it seems to me that another good thing that's happening is we're being returned to myth by all of this, because we
I
have to
think
go
so.
back to myth, you know?
I think the pandemic did that, along with
Yeah.
the political concerns and the over control, perhaps. There was a lot of poetic effort made at the time. Arundhati Roy also has a really beautiful passage that's quoted in a lot of memes. But yeah, I think the event is so huge, whether it's the pandemic or climate change or the political issues that are happening, the events in Ukraine, obviously, currently,
Yeah.
but they're so big that they require a mythic imagination.
To be
And
able to hold them or imagine them in your language or whatever.
to find form,
Yeah.
to put a face, to there's a mythic figure behind
Mm.
all this chaos.
Yeah.
Because chaos, after all, was
Mm.
the source. Chaos was not evil in a lot of
Mm.
these mythologies. Chaos was the underlying, you could say in modern physics, it's the unified field. So chaos is the womb and the tomb. It's the place we have to go back to start over again.
Yeah.
So it's this is
That's good.
telegraphing a lot, but that's the framework is how we could use, as you said, how we could use this
Mm.
crisis to return to something that could help us start over again.
I think that's a good place to leave it, Scott. And thank you very much once again.
Oh, well,
And
thank you.
when we get on to uh, volume 18 of the Life and Ideas of James Hillman, we can come back and revisit that as well. And but no, thanks for
Sure.
sharing all of that.
Yeah, I appreciate it.